The soldiers discovered something terrible during their patrol. This desert town with a daytime temperature of 49 degrees. In just one night, all the villagers had frozen into ice sculptures. What's even more frightening, one touch on the wrist and they would fall off. And on a beach in Brazil, there is also a strange incident. A powerful cold air instantly freezes a 100-meter wave, and then it spread to the land. The crowd on the beach panicked. Those who were too slow to run froze into ice sculptures. Even airliners at 10,000 meters in the air fell from the sky into pieces, and the desert in Dubai was even worse. There was a tsunami in the endless desert. Humans had no chance to escape. They were swallowed up by a huge wave. The world has seen one disaster after another, from start to finish, without a single warning. What happened to the Earth? After investigating, we realized it wasn't a natural disaster. It was a man-made disaster. Go back a few years. At that time, mankind was destroying the environment. That led to natural disasters. Global temperatures rose. Antarctic glaciers began to melt. A terrible hurricane appeared over London. Gradually, a 100-meter-high tsunami, swallowing the city. A heat wave in Madrid killed nearly 2 million people. The survival of the human race is at stake. In order to prevent this tragedy, scientists from all over the world have developed a joint program. They used a network of thousands of satellites in space. Each satellite has the ability to monitor the weather. Whenever there's a sign of a natural disaster, the satellites would emit corresponding energy elements to interfere. That's how it works. Mankind managed to save itself and named the system Dutch Boy, and it was the hero, Steven, who led the design team. But his single-mindedness infuriated the US government. In a meeting, the government kicked Steven off the team and replaced him with his brother, Will. Even though he knew it was all part of a plan from the top, the younger brother felt sorry for his brother Steven. After all, the Dutch boys were his brother's life's work. Time flies. 3 years later, the armed forces were on a mission in Afghanistan. A strange phenomenon was discovered. In the desert, where the surface temperature is 49 degrees, there was a whole village surrounded by ice. When the special forces entered, unexpectedly, the villagers were all frozen into ice sculptures. The United States of America, as the controller of the Dutch boys, after receiving the news, immediately held a meeting. After confirming that the Dutch boy was indeed malfunctioning, that caused the extreme contrast in climate. Since in a week's time, Holland boy will be handed over to the international organization. To ensure that nothing goes wrong in the meantime, the president ordered Will to investigate the cause of the accident. Will then found his brother, who had been fired. Steven knew the Dutch boys best, although he had always resented his brother taking over his job. But the Dutchman was his life's work. In the end, Steven agreed to go to the space station to repair Dutch Boy. On the other side, the station had retrieved the faulty satellite. Jack, the engineer in charge of the inspection, seemed to have found something in the satellite program, so he secretly put a copy of the data in the locker room. But just as he was leaving, the glass in the corridor suddenly shattered. A strong air current sucked him outside the station. At that moment, Hong Kong, China, also experienced an anomaly. Joe, the head of the Asia-Pacific satellite, accidentally dropped an egg on the ground. The next moment, the raw egg turned into an omelet. The ground in front of him began to crack. Joe saw that the situation was bad. He rushed to escape in his car. By now, the underground gas pipeline has already exploded. Fierce flames rose to the sky. Joe drove his car through the flames. After a life-threatening escape, he finally escaped from the disaster. When he looked back, the city was in ruins. Then Joe contacted Will and asked why he didn't have access to the satellite. Will checked immediately. He realized that he, as the chief administrator, didn't have access to it either. Joe guessed that the two incidents didn't look like accidents. Someone must be manipulating the Dutch boy to cover up a malfunction in the satellite system. I'm not finished yet. The power was suddenly cut off. A group of people broke into the office with guns. Luckily, he hid immediately. That's how he survived. On the other hand, Steven rode a rocket to the monitoring station. He soon met with the head of the station, Jade. After getting acquainted with the scientific members of the station, Steven received a video call from his brother. From Will, he learned that Hong Kong's satellite is also malfunctioning. Since it's impossible to access the data from the satellite remotely, Steven had to lead a manual inspection of the satellite. But then an accident happened. The satellite recovery arm suddenly lost control. The arm suddenly lost control of the satellite and crashed in all directions. Although Steven and others dodged in time and did not get hurt, but the recovered satellite has been completely destroyed. The hard disk that stored the information inside was also burned. Everyone was instantly confused. At that moment, a teammate told Steven a good news. They found out from the video that the hard drive on the door. The hard drive in the door panel wasn't destroyed. It's just stuck in the communication tower at the monitoring station. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But just as Steven was returning from retrieving the hard drive, he lost control of his suit. Luckily, with the aura of a protagonist, Steven grabbed a cable to save his life. After getting the hard drive, he didn't tell anyone. After this incident, Steven concluded that there must be a mole in the team. So he and Jade checked the information on the hard disk and found that the door panel was not malfunctioning at that time. It was controlled by someone to get out of the passageway. And Jack, the engineer, was killed on purpose. At the same time, Joe arrived in Washington. He was going to tell Will about his findings in person, but as he was crossing the street, he was pushed into the street by a man in black. A speeding car hit Joe in an instant. Before he died, He told Will about the second son of Zeus. Obviously, this is the key to solving the mystery. When he got back, he immediately made a video call to his brother. Fearful of being watched, they told a story in code. When the call was over, Steven took the video to his best friend, Blackie. The two of them watched the video over and over again, finally deciphered the mystery. Although this matter involves the government high level, but they didn't give up. Then they searched all the files with Zeus on them. They found an encrypted file for the Zeus program, but they needed access to open it. There was no other way. Will had to ask his girlfriend, who worked for the White House Secret Service, for help. After some sweet talk, she agreed to help. Soon they were able to open the file. Inside, Zeus' plan was to use the Dutch boy as a weapon to create a massive weather disaster and then blame the researchers for the malfunction. On the other side, Steven went through the backup servers and found footage from the day that engineer Jack was killed. Based on the information in the video, they found Jack's data hidden in a cabinet. Steven went through the data, only to find that someone had planted a virus in the satellite, trying to take over the Dutch boy's entire system at once. It was an emergency. Steven spoke to his brother again. After a conversation, the only way now is to reboot the Dutch boy's system to get rid of the virus, but to reboot the system, we need the ultimate password, and the only person who knows it is the president himself. So Will enlisted the help of his girlfriend again. Just as the two of them were planning to steal the code, the Dutch boys launched another global attack. Hailstones rained down on the streets of Tokyo. Buses were overturned in a flash. People who couldn't get out of the way lost their lives. At the same time, Brazil was hit by a frigid storm in the heat of the day. The waves were frozen in the air. Beachgoers were frozen into ice sculptures. Even airliners in the air were not spared. Now the Dutch boy is out of control. In an hour and a half, in half an hour, a terrifying geological storm will erupt across the globe. Steven's space station has lost control of its satellites. What's even more bizarre, the station has suddenly initiated a self-destruct sequence, and there's no way to reverse it, and the only programmer who could have caused it. And then it dawned on Steven. The programmer was the mole. He immediately arranged for the evacuation of everyone on the ship. He went to look for the programmer who planted the virus. When they met, they fought, just as the programmer was about to shoot Steven, but the bullet hit the glass of the room. Steven took the opportunity to escape outside. He locked the door behind him, and the programmer was sucked into space by the air currents. On the other side, Will, in order to get the ultimate code as soon as possible, he found the vice president who promoted him. He told him all about his plan. The vice president told him the code was the president's fingerprints and retinal information. When the vice president talked about the Zeus program, Joe's name came up. Will immediately sensed something was wrong, and the next thing he knew, the vice president pulled out a gun. Turns out he's the one behind it all. He's going to use the Dutch boy to weaken the other countries. Then he's gonna get rid of everyone who's qualified to be president. When he becomes president, he'll be able to take over the Dutch boys and rule the world. Luckily, Will reacted quickly and escaped. He found his girlfriend right away, and when she found out what happened, she decided to help, and then she used her position to cause an accident. Secret Service girlfriends are no joke. She tied the president to the car in a matter of minutes. Will told the president the whole story. He didn't believe him at first, until he saw the speech he'd just given was shattered by a lightning storm. He was convinced that Will was telling the truth. The first order of business was to get the final code to Steven. Just then, the killer came up behind him. The girlfriend, with her excellent driving skills, she managed to outrun the killer by a few blocks. The vice president is standing on the road ahead, waiting to wipe out Will and his team. When the car appeared in the line of sight, he immediately had his men fire off a handful of rockets, but the car was empty. That's when the vice president realized he'd been set up. His girlfriend managed to subdue him from behind. At that very moment, a geological storm created by the Dutch boys had begun. Giant tornadoes have hit India. Russia is being scorched by a satellite fire, and an old man was walking in the Dubai desert. That would have swallowed him up in minutes. On the other side, Steven told everyone to leave, but he went back to the base, because after entering the code, he had to reboot manually. He had to stay on Earth. The president entered his fingerprints and retina, but by now, the station had mostly self-destructed. After Steven got the final code, Steven immediately put on his spacesuit. He was ready to go to the control room to reboot the Dutch boy, but when he opened the control door, Steven realized that his code was no longer valid. Luckily, Jade appeared behind him. She hadn't been evacuated either. With Jade's help, the two of them successfully entered the control room. As the last satellite shut down, Steven pulled the Dutch boys' reboot switch. The out-of-control satellites gradually began to return to normal, and the geostorm crisis was averted. But the ultimate code couldn't stop the station's self-destruct sequence. Just then, Steven realized there was an intact satellite next to him. The two managed to get inside before the station exploded. There was a massive explosion. The station was reduced to ashes. Steven and Jade managed to escape in the satellite. A few months later, a new space station was built. Dutch boy was restored again. Now it belongs to all mankind, and now it's going to protect the human race.